The gathering storm. The cantina aboard the starship Voidpiercer hummed with the usual after-shift conversations. Officers from a dozen different species sat around metal tables, their drinks reflecting the ship's blue emergency lighting. But tonight something was different. Word had spread through the vessel that Captain Vextar, the most decorated veteran in the Fifth Fleet, had finally agreed to tell the story. The story that every young officer had heard whispers about, but none had been brave enough to ask for directly. Vextar sat alone at his usual corner table, his scaled green hide bearing the scars of 4 decades in space combat. His reptilian, eyes ancient and weary, stared into his glass of fermented Zalani root wine. The captain's uniform hung loose on his aging frame, but his presence still commanded respect from every being in the room. Lieutenant Creasa approached first, her insectoid legs clicking nervously against the metal floor. The young Thrix officer had joined the fleet only 6 months ago, fresh from the academy with honors in tactical warfare. Behind her followed Ensign Molt, his gaseous form shimmering in a containment suit, and Sergeant Quindal, whose 4 arms carried drinks for the group. "Captain," Creasa said, her mandibles clicking with nervous energy, "we heard you might finally tell us about the Terran incident." Vextar looked up slowly, his vertical pupils narrowing as he studied the eager faces around him. He had fought the Corvani Empire, survived the siege of Altair 7, and led charge after charge against the machine armies of the Synthetic Collective. But none of those battles had changed him like that one encounter with the species called humans. "Sit," he said finally, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "But know this. What I tell you tonight will change how you see warfare forever. Some knowledge comes with a price." The young officers exchanged glances, but took their seats. The cantina had grown quieter as other patrons sensed something important was about to unfold. Vextar took a long drink and began. It was 15 years ago, during the expansion into the Sol sector. Command had received reports of a new species that had established their first deep space outpost on a mining station they called Proxima Station. The intelligence reports were laughable. He paused, a bitter smile crossing his reptilian features. Bipedal mammals, average height 1.7 meters, no natural armor, no claws, no venom. Their technology was barely capable of faster-than-light travel. High Command classified them as a Category 3 species, minimal threat, suitable for standard pacification protocols. Molt's gaseous form pulsed with curiosity. What made them different from other primitive species? "That's what we thought we knew," Vextar replied. "The report said they called themselves humans, from a world they named Earth. A chaotic planet with extreme weather, predators, and constant natural disasters. Most species would have developed armor or enhanced strength to survive such conditions. But these humans had developed something else entirely, something our analysts completely missed." Sergeant Quindal leaned forward with 2 of his arms. "What did they develop?" "Madness," Vextar said quietly. "Beautiful, terrifying madness, disguised as ingenuity." The captain stood and began pacing, his clawed feet tapping against the floor. "I was commanding the cruiser Stellar Fang as part of Admiral Zorthak's pacification fleet. 12 ships, 8,000 soldiers, enough firepower to level a small moon. We arrived at Proxima Station expecting a quick surrender and smooth integration into the Alliance." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Lieutenant Creasa. "Have you ever seen a human, Lieutenant?" Creasa shook her head, her compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lights. "They look harmless," Vextar continued. "Soft pink or brown skin, tiny teeth, weak limbs. When we first made contact, their leader, a woman named Major Sarah Chen, came aboard our flagship for negotiations. She was small, maybe 1.6 meters tall, with dark hair and calm eyes. Admiral Zorthak actually laughed when he saw her." The captain returned to his seat and took another drink. "The standard procedure was simple. We would present the terms of incorporation into the Alliance. They would surrender their weapons and accept our protection, and we would establish a garrison on their station. It had worked on hundreds of worlds, with hundreds of species. But The humans refused? Ensign Molt asked. Worse, Vextar replied. They listened politely to every term, asked intelligent questions about the process, and then Major Chen looked Admiral Zorthak straight in his 6 eyes and said, Thank you for the offer, but we'll have to decline. Quindal's forearms gestured in confusion. They just said no? To a fleet of warships? Not just no, Vextar said, his voice growing darker. She said it with a smile, a human smile. I didn't understand what that meant then, but I learned. Oh, how I learned. The cantina had grown completely silent now. Even the ship's background hum seemed muted as other officers strained to listen. Admiral Zorthak gave them the standard ultimatum. Surrender in 24 hours or face the consequences. Major Chen nodded, thanked him for his time, and returned to her station. We expected panic, desperate communications to other human colonies, maybe a futile attempt to flee. Instead, we detected nothing. Complete communications silence. Vextar's scaled hands gripped his glass tighter. That should have been our first warning. When a species goes quiet in the face of overwhelming force, they're either preparing to surrender or preparing something else entirely. The captain stood again and walked to the cantina's viewport, staring out at the stars. 24 hours passed. No surrender. No communication. Admiral Zorthak ordered the attack to begin, but he wanted to minimize damage to the station's infrastructure. Standard suppression bombardment followed by boarding parties. Simple, clean, efficient. Turned back to face the young officers. The bombardment began at 0800 ship time. Our plasma cannons targeted their defensive systems, their communication arrays, their power generation facilities. Everything went exactly according to plan. Their shields failed within minutes. Their weapons went offline, and life support began fluctuating. By all tactical assessments, the station was crippled. Lieutenant Creasa clicked her mandibles thoughtfully. But they still didn't surrender. No, Vextar confirmed. And that's when we began to realize we weren't fighting the species we thought we knew. Our boarding shuttles launched with 200 of our best shock troops. I led the third wave myself. The captain's eyes grew distant as he recalled the memory. The docking bay was completely silent when we breached. Emergency lighting flickered, casting strange shadows everywhere. The air smelled of burned electronics, and something else, something organic and sharp that I couldn't identify. He paused to drink, his hands trembling slightly. We found the first human body near the main entrance. A young male, maybe 25 years old by their aging standards. He was lying face down, apparently killed when debris fell during our bombardment. Standard casualty of war. Vextar looked at each officer in turn. Except he wasn't dead. Ensign Molt's containment suit flickered with surprise. A wounded survivor? No, the captain said slowly. He was completely uninjured. The debris hadn't fallen on him. He had positioned himself under it. He was lying there perfectly still, waiting. When Sergeant Krell bent down to check if he was alive, the human moved faster than any being I'd ever seen. A blade appeared, in his hand from nowhere, and Krell was down before he could even cry out. The young officers exchanged alarmed glances. This wasn't the kind of battle story they had expected, but that was just the beginning, Vextar continued. As we moved deeper into the station, we found more bodies. Humans scattered throughout the corridors, all apparently killed in the bombardment. Our soldiers grew confident. The enemy was broken, scattered, defeated. He walked back to the table and sat down heavily. Then the bodies started getting up. The cantina was so quiet that the distant hum of the ship's engines sounded like thunder. Not all of them, Vextar clarified, but enough. They had studied our standard tactics, learned our procedures, and turned our own success against us. Every casualty we found was a potential ambush. Every corridor we secured could be lost in seconds. Major Chen had taken her people and taught them something that no other species had ever conceived of: how to use death itself as a weapon. Sergeant Quindal's voice was barely a whisper. They were pretending to be dead? More than that, Vextar replied. They had turned their entire station into a maze of deception. False walls, hidden passages, rooms that looked empty but contained waiting soldiers, and the humans themselves. They had become something new. The captain finished his drink and set the glass down with a sharp click. Major Chen appeared on our communication channels exactly 12 hours after the boarding began. Not from the command center we were fighting to reach, but from behind our own lines. She had somehow moved through areas we had already secured, without being detected. Vextar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She looked directly into the camera and said, "You wanted to see what humans do when we're desperate. Now you know. We don't run, we don't hide, and we don't surrender. We adapt." The old soldier stood up abruptly. "That's enough for tonight. Tomorrow I'll tell you about the second half of the battle, when we learned that human desperation isn't just dangerous, it's contagious." He walked toward the cantina exit, leaving the young officers sitting in stunned silence. At the doorway, he turned back one final time. "Sleep well tonight," he said. "After tomorrow's story, you might not sleep so easily again." The door closed, behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the cantina full of whispered conversations and nervous glances. Lieutenant Creasa looked at her fellow officers and saw her own unease reflected in their eyes. "Just pretending to be dead," Molt murmured, his gaseous form pulsing with anxiety. "How is that so terrifying?" But deep down, each of them already knew the answer. They had all been trained in standard military doctrine, had studied the tactics of dozens of species across the galaxy. None of them had ever considered that an enemy might weaponize the very concept of defeat itself. As the young officers finished their drinks and returned to their quarters, none of them noticed the figure, watching from the shadows near the cantina's back exit. Captain Vexistar stood there for a long moment, his ancient eyes reflecting the corridor's dim lighting. He had told them the easy part of the story tonight. Tomorrow, he would have to tell them about Dr. James Torres, about the medic who had shown him that human compassion could be even more terrifying than human violence. Tomorrow, he would have to explain how a species' greatest weakness had become their most devastating strength. The old veteran walked slowly through the ship's corridors toward his quarters, his clawed feet echoing in the empty passageways. Behind him, the cantina gradually emptied as other officers discussed what they had heard. But Vextar knew they hadn't truly heard anything yet. The real story was still to come. Hell Unleashed. The next evening, the cantina aboard the Void Piercer was packed beyond capacity. Word of Captain Vexistar's story had spread throughout the fleet, and officers from 3 different ships had requested permission to attend. The usual scattered conversations had been replaced by a tense, expectant silence as beings from a dozen species waited for the old veteran to continue his tale. Vextar entered the cantina to find his corner table, surrounded by familiar faces and many new ones. Lieutenant Creasa, Ensign Molt, and Sergeant Quindal had saved his usual seat, but now they were joined by Commander Othrak from the battleship Iron Serpent, Captain Voldar of the science vessel Starseeker, and at least 30 other senior officers. The reptilian veteran moved through the crowd slowly, acknowledging nods and salutes with weary grace. When he reached his table, the entire cantina fell silent. Even the serving staff stopped moving, unwilling to miss what had become the most anticipated story in the fleet. "So many faces tonight," Vexitar observed, pouring his usual glass of fermented root wine. "I hope you all understand that what you're about to hear is classified at the highest levels. What happened at Proxima Station changed how the Alliance approaches warfare with any species. There's a reason human military advisors now serve on every major fleet." He took a long drink and began without preamble. "When Major Chen cut our communications, Admiral Zorthak ordered a full tactical withdrawal to regroup, standard procedure when facing an unknown threat. But the humans weren't finished with their lessons." Vextar stood and began his familiar pacing, his clawed feet tapping against the metal floor. "Our shuttles began launching evacuation sequences, pulling our troops back to the ships. That's when we encountered Dr. James Torres." The captain stopped pacing and looked directly at Commander Othrak. "Have you ever seen an enemy medic, Commander?" Several times the gruff Corvani officer replied, usually trying to treat their wounded while staying out of combat. Torres was different, Vextar said. We found him in what appeared to be an abandoned medical bay treating wounded humans. When our soldiers entered, he looked up calmly and asked if any of our people needed medical attention. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the crowd. Ensign Molt's gaseous form flickered with uncertainty. He offered to help your soldiers? During a firefight? More than offered, Vextar replied. When Corporal Zextai took shrapnel from a human explosive device, Torres immediately began treating his wounds. Professional, efficient, completely focused on saving life rather than taking it. The captain returned to his seat and took another drink. I watched this human doctor work on one of my soldiers, using techniques I'd never seen before. He was gentle, precise, constantly explaining what he was doing to keep Zextai calm. For 30 minutes I forgot we were in the middle of a battle. Lieutenant Kreese's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. That sounds like normal medical ethics, Captain. Many species have rules about treating enemy wounded. Vextar's laugh was bitter and cold. That's what I thought too, Lieutenant. Until Torres finished treating Zextai and asked me a question that still haunts my dreams. The cantina was so quiet that the ship's life support system sounded like roaring wind. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, Captain, how many of your people are you willing to sacrifice to take this station? Vextar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I told him that was classified tactical information. He nodded, smiled that human smile, and said, I already know the answer. You'll sacrifice every single one of them rather than admit defeat. That's what makes this so tragic. The old veteran's hands gripped his glass so tightly that his scales turned pale. Then he stood up, helped Zextai to his feet, and walked calmly out of the medical bay. No guards, no weapons, no protection. He just walked away. Sergeant Quindal's forearms gestured in confusion. Why didn't you stop him? Because he was right, Vextar replied. Everything he said was absolutely correct. I would sacrifice every soldier under my command rather than retreat from a handful of primitive mammals. And somehow, this human doctor had looked into my soul and seen that truth. The captain stood again and walked to the viewport, staring out at the endless stars. Torres returned to the human lines, and 30 minutes later, every remaining human on the station surrendered. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. This wasn't the ending anyone had expected. Complete, unconditional surrender, Vextar continued. Major Chen contacted Admiral Zorthak personally, offered to turn over all weapons, all defensive systems, all command codes. The battle was over. Commander Othrak frowned deeply. Then why do you call it the most terrifying battle of your career? You won. Vextar turned back to face the crowd, and his ancient eyes held a depth of fear that made several officers step back involuntarily. Because we didn't win, he said quietly. We were played, manipulated, led exactly where the humans wanted us to go. The captain walked back to his table but remained standing. The surrender was real, but it wasn't defeat. It was the final phase of their plan. You see, humans don't just fight battles, they fight wars. And wars aren't won by holding territory or destroying enemies. Wars are won by changing how your opponent thinks. He gestured around the crowded cantina. Look around this room. How many species do you see? How many different worlds, different cultures, different ways of thinking about combat? Officers began counting, recognizing Corvani, Thrix, Zelani, Altarian, and half a dozen other species represented in the crowd. 47 different worlds. Vextar answered for them. 47 species that all approached warfare in predictable ways based on their biology, their evolution, their instincts. The humans studied us for generations through our first contact protocols, our cultural exchanges, our trade negotiations. They learned exactly how we think, how we plan, how we react to threats. The old soldier's voice grew stronger, more urgent. Then they used that knowledge to teach us something we never wanted to learn. They showed us that every assumption we had about warfare was wrong. Lieutenant Kreesa's compound eyes reflected her growing understanding. The entire battle was a demonstration. Exactly, Vextar confirmed. Every tactic they used, every surprise they revealed, every moment they made us question our own procedures. It was all carefully planned to prove a single point. He walked around the room, looking at each officer in turn. The point was that humans don't fight the way their bodies were designed to fight. They fight the way their minds allow them to fight, and human minds are capable of adapting to any situation, any enemy, any challenge. The captain stopped in the center of the room. Major Chen's final message to Admiral Zorthak was simple. Today you fought humans who had 3 days to prepare. Imagine what we could become with 3 months, or 3 years. We're not asking you to fear us. We're asking you to respect what desperation can create. Ensign Molt's gaseous form pulsed rapidly with anxiety. What happened after the surrender? The Alliance Council met in emergency session, Vextar replied. Every major power in the galaxy received copies of our battle recordings. Within 6 months, every fleet had human tactical advisors. Within a year, human military doctrine was being taught at the Academy. The captain returned to his seat and finished his drink. But that wasn't the most important change. The most important change was psychological. He stood one final time and faced the assembled officers. Before Proxima Station, we believed that superior technology and numbers guaranteed victory. We believed that warfare was predictable, controllable, manageable. The humans showed us that none of that matters when you're facing an enemy that refuses to be what you expect them to be. Vextar walked toward the cantina exit, then stopped and turned back to address the crowd one last time. Dr. Torres found me 6 months later at a diplomatic reception on Centauri Prime. He walked up to me, smiled that same human smile, and said, "Thank you for letting us show you who we really are. Now you understand why we've survived every catastrophe our planet could throw at us." The old veteran's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent room. Then he said something that still wakes me up at night. He said, "Captain, you've seen what humans do when we're desperate to survive. Pray you never see what we do when we're desperate to protect something we love." The cantina door closed behind Captain Vextar with a soft hiss, leaving behind a room full of beings who would never again look at warfare the same way. In the weeks that followed, his story spread throughout the fleet, then throughout the Alliance, changing how every species approached the concept of conflict. The humans had won their first interstellar battle not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but by teaching their enemies that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy wasn't a plasma cannon or a fusion bomb. It was an open mind, willing to become whatever the situation demanded, and that lesson, once learned, could never be forgotten.